2001's Final Scream, also known as Final Stab, presented me with an actually quite nice moment, as it's in effect a little bit of a J.R. Bookwalter reunion, reuniting the SOV Six-Packs producer David Decoteau with Matthew Jason Walsh of Zombie Cop and Legend of the Mummy 2 fame. From what I can see, I don't believe I've covered a Decoteau written or directed film on this channel yet. Well, barring the LA portions of Chickboxer, but I hardly think they count. The main reason I've tended to avoid Decoteau's work stems largely from the same place as why I don't cover more Jess Franco movies, honestly. David's work is uneven. I think that's the kindest way I can put it. While he has some modest hits with things like Puppet Master 3 and Witch House, a lot of his other works, I would argue, barely constitute films. Stuff like his 1313 series of movies, which are literally just 70 to 90 minute features where 2 to 3 veteran horror actors or actresses will kinda wander around a set and say slightly mysterious stuff, while a load of hunk-a-dunk guys also wander around the set or location taking their tops off and saying things that are moody or also mysterious. There's 14 of those. And if he isn't doing stuff like that, he works in the lower end of most of the major genres, producing films where the quality is so uneven in such large volumes that if I stopped reviewing anyone else and just focused on his movies from now on, I'd have a stable run of reviews to see me through to the end of the 2030s. Whether it's seasonal fodder, family flicks, or his traditional ground of horror, Decoteau's a machine that just pumps out like 6 to 10 films a year. And with a staggering 176 directing credits and no sign of slowing down, it was all but inevitable that I'd end up covering one of his movies at some point. So what is Final Scream? Well, if the box art and the fact it was made in 2001 didn't give it away, Final Scream was an attempt by Decoteau to cash in on the Scream franchise. Scream 3 came out in the year 2000, and in an attempt to try and trick people into thinking Scream 4 was a thing, Decoteau rushed through a movie with zero connection to the Scream franchise apart from the fact that two characters like horror movies, shot it in about 4 days and kicked it up the arse and out the door as Final Scream. After a while, Dimension Films, the owner of the Scream franchise, clocked this and threats of legal action were sent Decoteau's way, forcing him to change the name to Final Stab, which in and of itself is a reference to the Scream universe. The film's main characters are Angela and Charlie, and the film opens with Charlie watching a horror movie when he gets a call from Angela who's vying for some bouncy. Charlie goes to freshen up, but while he's in the shower there's a power cut. After some moody wandering around in the dark where someone appears to have left a strobe light on, Charlie eventually bumps into Angela, and the pair start preparing for the night. Charlie hears another noise, and after exploring a bit more, a scary killer jumps out and stabs him. But oopsie doops, it's just a dream. Ugh. It turns out that this is a reoccurring dream that Charlie's had every night for years, and after trying medications, therapy, and more, nothing has shifted it. Angela is supportive of Charlie, but just wishes she knew the best way to try and help him. Anyway, this is basically a precursor to the next day's events, as we're then introduced to Doug and Kristen. Kristen is Angela's estranged sister, and Doug has a history with Charlie, and the pair are about to lay down some serious havoc. See, Kristen wants to reconnect with her sister, so she's decided to throw a party and invite the pair over. The location of the party is the infamous Polero estate. So called because according to local legend, in 1995, the Polero family were all living their best lives when someone broke in and butchered all of them, with no witnesses and next to no evidence. At this point in the film, the plan for the party itself is a bit vague, but Doug alludes to the fact that he's not happy with what Kristen's got planned. Kristen, however, has dirt on Doug and basically says she'll go public if he doesn't help. She then tells him she wants him to go and see Angela to invite her to the party, acting as a kind of middleman between Angela and Kristen, because Kristen doesn't think that Angela will give her the time of day. Doug reluctantly heads off, and Kristen starts work on preparing the house for the party. Meanwhile, in the woods just behind the house, some dude bros are just shooting the shit, and one of them reveals that he's found a flyer asking for actors to appear in a project that Kristen is working on. They think that it's some kind of play or art project, and because Kristen comes from a rich family and has always been seen as a bit of a prep, the Dude Bros decide that now's the perfect time to dish out some sweet, sweet bullying. And they all agree to go and stake out the house with the aim of sabotaging shit. You know, cutting the power, slashing people's tyres, destroying any props that would be needed, all that bollocks. It's here that we're introduced to some of the other characters for the film. There's Steve and Brett, our jocks for this picture, and nothing else. And then there's Julie and Patrick, a couple who've agreed to help set things up, and while setting things up, Julie gets chatting to Patrick about Charlie and reveals that when she slept with her mum's therapist, she found out that Charlie had a lot of issues growing up. When he was a kid, he witnessed his mum and dad get butchered by a random killer, no one was ever caught, no evidence was ever found, and Charlie spent a not insignificant amount of time in asylums, therapy, and on heavy medication. Somehow the way Julie explains this makes it sound like Charlie is somehow a lesser being for having had that happen to him, and almost makes out that Angela could do better because of it, which is a bit odd. As an aside, because it doesn't really fit in anywhere, but I feel like I can't omit it, while this is all going on, the Dude Bros start scoping out the house using cell phones, and one by one, each of these Dude Bros is picked off by the killer, barring one, who also does get killed, but just a little bit later in the movie. They don't add anything to the picture, they eat up a not unreasonable amount of the runtime, given that the film's only about 74 minutes long, and honestly, I have no idea why they even made it into the final cut, given they don't actually interact with our main cast in any way apart from, I think that Angela might find one dead in the final act. Anyway, it's the night of the party and Charlie and Angela have both been coerced into going, and I'll try to keep this as brief as possible because I don't want to over-egg exactly what is going on here. The pair enter the house and it's revealed that it's a surprise party, but when everyone jumps out it triggers Charlie, who has to go get some air. When things get a bit calmer, Angela and Kristen bury the hatchet and the night finally gets underway. Only it doesn't, because almost immediately a killer pops up behind Steve and murders him. This traumatises Charlie, who immediately bolts from the house again. Angela gives Doug her keys and tells him to go and get help before she runs out of the house to go and try and find Charlie. And it's here that the whole point of the film is revealed. And boy howdy, is it convoluted. So, it transpires that everyone at the party, with the exception of Doug, hates Charlie. Like, they don't just dislike him, they actively hate him. Kristen thinks that Angela can do better and doesn't want Charlie to join their family, so she's told her friends that they're doing a dry run of a murder mystery party and that she wants Angela and Charlie to be the unknowing participants in this murder mystery party to see if it works out and to make sure that all the clues are correct. That's the overt interpretation of the plan though. What the friends are doing covertly is basically in an attempt to break Angela and Charlie up. They're pretty much all aware of Charlie's background and they hope that if they can ramp up the scares enough, it'll make Charlie flip out, leading to either Angela realising she's let herself in for more than she bargained for, or Charlie being sent back to the asylum. Either way, it results in them splitting up. Everyone at the party has fake blood pouches, they've hired an actor to play the killer, and the plan is to have them all get fake murdered one by one, then whoever is left will meet up at a gazebo outside the house, where it'll all be revealed as a funny joke, and apart from Charlie being sectioned, everything will be fine. Unfortunately, they didn't factor on there being an actual killer also on the premises who begins to actually murder the friends one by one. And that's pretty much the rest of this movie. The friends slowly get actually murdered, and every single time they play the "oh no, it's the killer, please don't murder me, oh wait, he's real, ah" card. Angela and Charlie have a few heart-to-hearts, and all this builds to a final act that is beyond convoluted and was incredibly underwhelming. In a film where, I swear to God, they tell you the ending in the first 15 minutes and then act super proud of themselves in the last 10 minutes when they retell you the ending again, will Charlie and Angela's relationship survive? Who is the mysterious masked killer? And did David Decoteau actually watch any of the Scream movies before writing this thing? All this and more will be answered if you check out Final Scream. And What I find ridiculous about this film is its structure is insane. For the vast majority of the second act, this is one of the most generic 90s slasher movies I've ever seen. It's not particularly badly written, and they do handle some of what they're trying to do with a modicum of respectability, but there's literally nothing here that stand out from any other slasher movie from the time. All the tropes are present in this thing, from having multiple killers to everyone's a suspect, to the aforementioned final act, where the final girl runs around the murder house one by one finding her dead friends and being like, oh no, my friends are dead. It really doesn't miss a beat. But then, bookending this generic middle bulge is some of the most convoluted writing for a slasher that I've ever seen. I've got to spoil the ending really to prove my point, so here's a warning from here on in. But at the end of the film, Kristen basically reveals herself to be the killer, and her plan was to basically kill off all her friends who she didn't like anyway, and Angela, and then pin it all on Charlie. This would result in Kristen being able to claim her family's full inheritance rather than having to share it with Angela. Charlie then reveals that him and Angela thought that this was what Kristen was up to, so they counter-planned for it by making sure Angela's real knife that Kristen stole was swapped for a prop one. Angela then murders Kristen with the real knife. But just before the credits roll, they then pull back a further layer by ending on an open ending that implies that Charlie is in fact a killer and that he murdered Doug, and possibly many more, for his own modus operandi. Which, I mean, killing Doug would make sense because apparently him and Doug had some kind of sordid history, but the rest? I have no idea. Honestly, the ending of this film just reminds me of the ending of Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, where every time the bad guy has a "aha, I've got you" moment, Bill and Ted retort with their own "aha, we knew you'd do that, so we did this" moment. It's just such an odd contrast because that middle part of the narrative is so predictable that when all this 4D chess bollocks turns up at the end, I had to kind of pause just to take stock as it genuinely caught me off guard. That's not to say I think the ending is clever or particularly interesting. I think if your average stoner watched this thing, they'd probably be like, whoa, mate, this is, mate, whoa. But for anyone not high as balls, it comes out of left field, feels tonally out of step with the rest of the narrative and doesn't really hold up to much scrutiny. If Kristen knew that Charlie had a traumatised past, why even bother setting the party up? Why not just kill Angela at Charlie's place and then make it look like a domestic incident? I just don't get why it needed to be this elaborate grand set piece for any other reason than it makes a movie. Barring the beginning and the end of the film, which are predominantly info dump sessions or dreams, the pacing for this thing is fairly fast. I'm not going to lie, there is padding here, but it's not intrusive padding, for the most part. What's been done here is a pinch and inch technique, where they take an underrunning script and just make some scenes run on for a few seconds longer than planned. We're not talking 5-minute sequences where nothing advances the plot, we're talking making drive-in sequences or establishing shots just a little bit longer than they should be to try and grab back 10 seconds here, maybe a minute or two there. The Dude Bro subplot takes about 8 to 10 minutes, and even though it adds nothing to the situation ultimately, the fact that they spread those scenes out across 1 to 3 minute bursts along the entire 30-minute opening runtime makes it feel less like padding. It's nuanced padding, unintrusive padding. It's there to just get it over the line, but not to the detriment of the rather generic main plot. There isn't really much of a solid act structure either, honestly. Everything up to the party starting is really just kind of happenstance. There's no script structure that ties all these threads together. We're just having characters thrown at us and being asked to weigh up how we feel about them. There's almost no interaction between cast members outside of their pairings that they're introduced to us as. Basically, up to the point where Charlie and Angela attend the party, the footage in front of that might as well be flashcards for all the coherence it offers in terms of a structured opening act. The second act then bulges out for I'd say about 40 to 50 minutes of the runtime, being slightly better structured but not by much, which then ends with a crushed 10 to 15 minute long third act that tries to come across as hyper intelligent, but just totally fails to read the room. In that regard, it is really kind of a mess. The dialogue's not too great either, honestly, with some really rather flat lines that just about put the point across and progress the narrative, but they aren't inspiring or particularly interesting. There's nothing quotable or even really memorable on show here, as we just kind of grind through the plot from dawn to dusk. I was going to say that this film feels like someone half-watched Scream and then decided that writing snarky was all you had to do to win Gen Xers and elder millennials over. But to be fair to Scream, at least it stuck to its premise of horror nerds get stalked by a killer who knows about horror movies. I mean, I don't particularly like Scream, but at least it is what it is. Final Scream is so non-committal to its source material. Charlie and Kristen both mention they like horror movies 2, maybe 3 times in this film altogether at the very beginning and very end. And apart from literally 2 mentions of both Friday the 13th and Halloween, this film doesn't reference, mention or raise anything to do with horror movies. No references, no nerdy filmmaker talk, no mention of directors, nothing. And in a way, I'm relieved, because one of my pet peeves with horror movies is when they get all self-indulgent and fan-wanky about existing horror IPs, to the point that they start dropping references or flat out naming horror movies to try and endear themselves to the horror community. But there's no worries of that happening here. Other than the mentions above, this film doesn't do anything like that, which totally defeats the point of it being a Scream knockoff, but I kinda don't care. As mentioned, the script was written by Matthew Jason Walsh. We've already covered him off as part of our adventures in the SOV 6-pack, but I will say that this film falls just under halfway through his writing career, and seemingly in a period where he was writing predominantly sequels and films based on other films. In fact, the film he wrote before this one is called I've Been Watching You, and seems to be trying to do the same thing Final Scream is doing here, but with I Know What You Did Last Summer instead. As for the other writer and director of this, David Decoteau has 176 directing credits and 45 writing credits as of the time of recording, with notable entries including Puppet Master 3, Sorority Babes in the Slimeball Bowl-orama, and Creepazoids. The man's a machine, a Roger Corman, Godfrey Ho, Jess Franco type who fires films out faster than they're loaded in. That is no sign of quality, but in terms of volume, yeah, I'm pretty impressed. On the direction front, it's passable. It looks like a late 90s, early 2000s horror movie. And while they maybe over-egg a few tropes here and there, the biggest issue I personally had was the fact that they had a strong over-reliance on strobe lighting to imitate lightning. But they had the strobe set too fast and the intervals aren't random enough. So it just looks like someone's left a strobe light on accidentally in the other room. For the most part, I'd say the direction was perfectly serviceable for a film of this time and budget. In fact, given that it was shot in 4 days, I'm actually kind of impressed at how solid this thing has actually turned out. I mean, I want to be careful not to overestimate its quality here. In the grand scheme of 90s and 2000s slashers, this is no trendsetter. But it looks the part for the most part. I think if you're looking for that, this might actually be up your alley. Direction of the cast isn't quite so sharp, mind. While the in-studio stuff is more than serviceable, barring a couple of slightly jerky moments, the location work is a little disappointing, honestly. Cast members seem a bit lost. They don't really confidently deliver their lines, and it feels, to me at least, almost like they had something going on during the location shoots that made it difficult for the cast to focus on what was at hand. Whether it was time limitations, external distractions, or just a case of the director or the cast not being in their A-game headspace during these scenes, I can't really say. It's purely speculation. But I just feel like the cast really weren't as solid outdoors as they were under studio conditions. The Cine, I'd say, is probably this film's strongest element. It still doesn't quite match the creative highs of mid-budget horror Cine, but it does feel like effort has been put into making this thing look as nice as it can given the budget and time limitations. Shots mostly have decent composition of frame, there's a nice variety of shot types used, and even some decent lighting implemented in places to help create a low light but moody atmosphere, without getting things so dark that you can't actually see what's going on. Is it perfect? No. I personally feel that while the sequences are solid, they have a bit too much room to breathe. I'd have preferred an edit with much tighter cuts and with more experimentation in the shot types implemented. Dutch angles, Dutch pans, all that good stuff. The energy in this edit is rather lacking, and I feel with a few more shot types and quicker cutting it could have created something that was a bit more engaging to the audience. As it stands, it's more than functional and even looks great at some points. I appreciate given the budget and scope they probably didn't have the time to be ultra out there or creative on construction, but it still would have been nice to see something a bit more than solid. Performance wise, it's TV acting, and not good TV acting. I don't know, everyone here is trying, I'll give them that, but all the performances are just so thin on the ground and so fake. An example being Michael Lutz and Forrest Cochran as Steve and Brett, two characters in this who pretty much have no point being here. What does Brett do in this film? Like, what's his actual function? As far as I can see, it's to be a foil to Steve for about 5 minutes and to help pad the runtime with an extra death scene. Steve doesn't fare much better, getting about 10 minutes to actively have a purpose in this film as the first fake victim, before getting an additional 5 minutes to be the first real victim, barring the dude bros, and then he's dead for the rest of the film. Neither of them, in my opinion at least, bring any presence to the role or even the film. I'd say they give a bad performance, but when the script gives them so little to work with in the first place, it's kinda no wonder they underperformed. Probably the best performer in this is Erin Hayes as Kristen, and even then that's a case of the best of a bad bunch. She's playing it melodramatic, or at least I hope she's playing it melodramatic. And she really gets into that bitchy badness with a zeal and relish that I felt quite passionately about. She made me dislike the character, which was absolutely the script's intention. So I have to take my hat off to her. While I wouldn't say her performance was great, she got the job done without making me question her existence. As for the rest of the cast, they're some of the beigest performances I've ever seen. Part of that again is down to the script, part of it may have been down to a lack of directorial steer or direction that didn't really give the actors much motivation as to the nature of their roles, but part of it has to be down to just the actors not really giving these parts their all. I didn't feel passionate about any of these characters, none of them made me care about them or what happened to them. Ultimately, when a film leaves you thinking, does it matter if these people are in the movie or not, and they're some of the main characters, you know that something hasn't quite gone to plan. And finally, the soundtrack. And if you've ever seen a Full Moon production, you've heard the score for this movie. Decoteau has close ties to Charles Band and Full Moon Films, so it's unsurprising that the scoring for this movie would pool from the same people who are seemingly unlicensed for scoring at Full Moon. But yeah, it's a somewhat generic MIDI-generated border orchestral slush. It'll make you feel something, but exactly what is hard to define. It's not quite boredom, but it's a feeling of muggy familiarity that just creeps up on you and then leaves you feeling largely unremarkable. Definitely not one I'd seek out. It helps to set the mood, but it's just way too generic for my blood. Final Scream was released in the UK on DVD by Third Millennium Films in early 2002. I'm having a bit of trouble pinning down the exact month of a release in the UK, but I can narrow it down to between January and June of 2002. After a brief circulation as a standalone release, it would later end up being one of the staple films for release as part of the various Prism Leisure multi-film DVD packs that were often bundled up with DVD players to help make it look like you were getting a better deal. And when I say staple, I'm speaking anecdotally here, but from memory this thing was everywhere. I struggle to think of a time I didn't see one of those DVD bundle sets where that film wasn't included somewhere on it. As a result, Amazon is plagued with DVD copies of this movie going for next to nothing. The DVD copy is also quite sophisticated for a low-budget pressing. There's a trailer, scene select, a photo gallery, and a fully interactive DVD menu. which genuinely surprised me as I was concerned that this film wouldn't even have a play button, quite honestly. After its DVD release, it would pretty much disappear into the ethos until 2022, when Massacre Video announced a very nice looking Blu-ray reissue under its alternate title of Final Stab. And I feel that through a mixture of mixed reviews about selling the film as something it isn't and the misleading promotional material and lawsuits, Massacre have learnt a valuable lesson here and have very wisely chosen to release the film with alternate artwork on the packaging. It now bears zero resemblance to the Scream franchise. And honestly, I feel that's the best way to package this, as I feel people may get on with it better without pre-established subconscious bias. Features include a 2K scan from the original 35mm print. This thing was shot on 35mm? Good lord! Anyway, there's a new audio commentary with David Decoteau and some trailers, so the extras are a bit thin on the ground. Not that it matters, because this was a limited edition release that's now out of print. But I'd put money on there being a standard edition reissue in the future, so if you want one, maybe give it a year or two. Final Scream isn't as bad as it could have been, but that's fairly faint praise when you consider that it could have also been so much better. This is just a fairly run-of-the-mill slasher that doesn't rock the boat much, which really is part of the problem. It's a solid enough production with a script that doesn't exactly wow, but it just about does enough to keep a faint interest held to it. Some of the Cine direction give the impression it's probably on a bigger budget than it actually was, but with a mixture of bizarre script choices in places, mixed to poor performances and a total unwillingness to really do anything interesting with the pitch beyond stick to the formula, this is a movie that left me somewhat tepid. A middling slasher that's notable really more for its blatant attempt at trying to rip off a then popular franchise more than anything else, I'd say this might be worth watching as it is a bit of an oddity, but otherwise there are plenty of better slashers out there to explore.